They were still holding on to her, but she wasn't breathing anymore. One of the newborns tried to move and couldn't. The other made a weak sound, barely audible, then went still again. They had been out there long enough that the ground around them had gone cold, long enough that the rangers had already radioed for help, long enough that nobody was sure help would matter anymore. A ranger knelt down, looked once, then looked away. He pressed his radio and spoke quietly, like he didn't want the words to land too hard. "They won't last an hour," he said, and nobody argued with him because nobody believed he was wrong. That's when she walked in. No panic in her face, no rushing. She moved the way people move when they've seen this before, not because it doesn't affect them, but because falling apart right now helps no one. She stopped at the edge, looked once at the mother, looked once at the two newborns still pressed against her. Then she turned to the rangers standing behind her and said 2 words, "Move back." They moved. She already knew what touching them meant. She knew the risk, that her scent, her presence, her hands on their bodies could trigger something irreversible. That stress alone at this stage could finish what the cold had already started. She knew all of it, and she reached down anyway. She picked one up, then the other. One of them reacted immediately. A faint resistance, a tiny pull of energy from somewhere deep. The other didn't react at all, just hung there, quiet and still against her hands. And that silence was the thing that made everyone in that space hold their breath without realizing they were doing it. She wasn't trying to save them both anymore. She was trying not to lose either one. The first feeding attempt failed. She tried the smaller one first, positioned it carefully, controlled her own breathing, brought the feeding tool close. Nothing. No response. No instinct firing. Just a small body that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to stay. She pulled back, didn't react visibly, didn't sigh, didn't look at anyone else in the room for reassurance. She just paused, the way someone pauses when they're not giving up, they're just thinking. Then she changed her approach, slower this time, closer, less pressure. She gave it space to respond instead of forcing a response out of it. And everyone around her understood without being told that noise right now was interference, so nobody made any. The room held itself completely still, like even the air had decided to stay out of the way. Then it happened, a swallow, small, barely visible, but real. She saw it, and didn't celebrate it, didn't look up, didn't let the relief show on her face, because celebrating too early is its own kind of distraction. She just kept going, same pace, same steadiness, not rushing toward the progress, just following it carefully, the way you follow something fragile that might stop at any moment. But the second one was different. While the first was beginning to respond, the second was beginning to fade. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself clearly. Just a quietness that was different from rest, a stillness that felt heavier than before. She felt it before she could name it, that shift in weight, that change in the quality of the silence coming off that small body. And she looked between the two of them, one responding, one retreating, and understood exactly what kind of moment this was. She knew she might only save one, and she had to decide without time to think. Hours passed. Not days. Hours. Because days would have meant something different. Days would have meant the story had already resolved itself one way or another. But hours meant it was still moving, still uncertain, still balanced in that narrow space where everything could still go either way. Then the weaker one moved. Not the stronger one. Not the one who had swallowed first. Not the one who had shown the earliest signs of response. The one everyone had quietly, privately, already started to let go of. That one moved. Lifted its head, shifted its weight, turned slightly toward the warmth nearest to it, which happened to be her. She didn't move, didn't reach for it, just held still and let it come. Because that moment, that small animal making a small decision about where the safety was, that wasn't something you interrupted. That was something you respected. That was the whole point of everything that had come before it. All the stillness, all the patience, all the controlled breathing and the slow approach and the deliberate restraint. It had all been building toward this, toward a moment small enough that most people would have missed it entirely. She didn't miss it, and then both of them were responding. The feeding was working, the movement was returning in both of them now. Not fully, not strongly, not in any way that meant the danger had passed, but enough to change what the next hour looked like, enough to shift the weight of the room. The ranger who had said they wouldn't last an hour looked at the floor for a long moment before he looked back up. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They weren't gone. Not yet. Recovery, when it came quietly. There was no single moment where everything shifted into the clear. No dramatic turn where the danger lifted and the relief flooded in all at once. It didn't work that way, and she would have been the first person in that room to tell you so. She had done this long enough to know that recovery isn't a moment. It's a direction. A slow, fragile, sometimes reversible movement away from the edge and towards something more stable, and you don't celebrate the direction until it holds, until it proves itself over time, over hours, over small repeated signs that what you're seeing is real progress and not just a temporary pause before another decline. So she watched, and she waited, and she kept working. The next few hours moved differently than the ones before them. The first hours had been all urgency, compressed, high stakes, every minute carrying the full weight of what was at risk. These hours were quieter, slower, but in their own way they required just as much from her. Because this is the part nobody sees when they imagine what rescue looks like. They imagine the dramatic intervention, the reaching down, the first response, the moment of connection. They don't imagine the long stretch afterward, when the emergency has passed but the fragility hasn't, and the work becomes about consistency rather than speed, about showing up the same way, hour after hour, without the adrenaline to carry you through it. She showed up the same way. Every feeding was approached with the same steadiness she had brought to the first one. Every check, every adjustment, every small moment of assessment was done with the same focused quiet. She didn't perform the care, she just delivered it. And that distinction mattered more than it might sound, because animals at this stage read everything. They read tension in the hands that hold them. They read distraction in the pace of movement. They read uncertainty in the way a person breathes. And what they were reading from her, consistently across every interaction, was safety, not excitement, not urgency, just safety, offered over and over again until it became the environment they were living inside. And slowly, slowly enough that you could almost miss it if you weren't paying attention, they began to settle into it. The smaller one, the one that had faded while the other was first responding, was now eating with something approaching regularity. Not perfectly, not without interruption. There were still moments where it pulled back, still moments where the progress stalled and everyone in the room recalibrated quietly. But the overall direction was holding. The swallows were coming more consistently. The body was beginning to use what was being given to it. And the stillness that had felt so heavy earlier, that particular stillness that carries the weight of a body giving up, had been replaced by something different. A rest that looked like rest. A quiet that looked like recovery. The stronger one was further along, moving more, responding faster, showing the kind of small insistent energy that belongs to something that has decided to stay. It had made its decision earlier and had been building on it ever since, and now that decision was visible in the way it held itself, in the way it tracked movement, in the way it reacted to her presence not with fear or with indifference, but with something that looked, in its small animal way, like recognition, like it had learned something about who she was in relation to its own survival, like it understood, in the only way it was capable of understanding, that she was the reason it was still here. She stepped back for a moment, just to look, just to take in what was in front of her without the immediate pressure of the next task pulling her forward. Two small lives that had been on the absolute edge of not making it, pressed against a mother who was already gone, in a cold that was already working against them, with a window of time that had already been closing when she walked through the door. And they were here, still fragile, still uncertain, still carrying all the vulnerability that would be with them for weeks to come. But here, she didn't say anything. She wasn't the kind of person who marked moments with words when the moment itself was already saying everything that needed to be said. She just stood there for a few seconds, in that particular kind of stillness that belongs to someone who has spent enormous energy on something and is now allowing themselves briefly to feel the weight of what it meant. Not the triumph of it, not the relief of it, exactly, more like the significance of it. The quiet recognition that something that could have gone the other way didn't, and that her presence, her judgment, her willingness to reach down when everything was uncertain, had been part of why. Then she turned back to the work, because that's what this kind of person does. The rangers who had been present for all of it moved differently now too. The one who had said they wouldn't last an hour was quieter than he had been before, but it wasn't a heavy quiet. It was the quiet of someone recalibrating, updating what they had believed to be true based on what they had just seen. That's its own kind of gift, when a situation teaches you something about the distance between probably not going to make it and made it. That distance is where she had always worked. That distance was where she had built everything she knew. The hours that followed were about maintenance, about protecting the progress that had been made. The temperature was controlled, the feedings continued on schedule, the handling was kept minimal and deliberate, only what was necessary, never more. Because the temptation, once things start improving, is to engage more, to want more contact, more confirmation, more visible signs of connection, and that temptation, however well-intentioned, is its own form of risk. They didn't need more from her right now. They needed consistency. They needed the environment around them to stay stable while their own systems did the quiet internal work of recovery. so she kept it simple, kept it steady, kept showing up the same way. By the time the light outside had changed, that particular shift that happens when a day has fully committed to being over, both of them were in a different place than they had been 12 hours earlier. The difference wasn't dramatic from the outside. They were still small, still dependent, still a long way from anything that could be called stable in the long-term sense of the word. But the immediate crisis had passed. The hour-by-hour uncertainty had loosened its grip just enough to allow something like cautious forward movement. And that, in this kind of work, is not a small thing. That is everything. She stepped back one final time, looked at them both, still, calm, breathing, and let the moment be what it was without adding anything to it. They had come in against nothing. No mother, no warmth, no time, no odds worth counting on. And they were still here because someone had walked through a door without hesitation, had spoken 2 words with complete authority, and had reached down into an impossible situation with steady hands and a clear mind, and the kind of experience that doesn't come from anywhere except the accumulated weight of every hard moment that came before it. She didn't save them with hope. She didn't save them with feeling, or with wanting it badly enough, or with the kind of determined optimism that makes for a better story but a worse outcome. She saved them by acting before it was too late, by knowing what to do and doing it immediately, without waiting for certainty, without waiting for permission, without waiting for the situation to become less frightening before she engaged with it. That is the only kind of saving that has ever actually worked. Not the kind that waits for the right moment, the kind that creates one. And now they were breathing, both of them, quietly, steadily, in the particular way that small living things breathe when the danger has passed and the body has finally been given permission to rest. She walked out of the room. The work wasn't finished. It never really is. But for right now, in this moment, at the end of this particular day, it was enough.